So, as I said, it's very important to me as I tell this story uh, to remember that it isn't a story about a husband, a wife, and the other woman. It's about three very particular, very individual persons. So I'm going to use names: Claude and Eloise and Chris. The story begins with me having an affair with Claude, a professor in my own field at another university. And remember, I'm talking about an event that took place 50 years ago. We are both married. We both have every expectation of staying in our marriages. But the connection between us is very deep, very intimate, and the affair goes on for at least 3 years. We spend as much time together as we can manage, usually with the excuse of some professional gathering, mostly weekends. But once a longer trip to California, this all happened back east, and another occasion about a month together in Europe. I'm in an open marriage. So though I never share details, my husband George knows of the relationship and knows that it's important to me. But I let Claude persuade me that his wife Eloise wouldn't want to know. And I think even in retrospect, I would say that probably at one level that's true. She would have preferred not to know, right? Yeah. But of course, eventually, she does find out. One morning, she gets up early to look at a Picasso lithograph of a mother and child that Claude had brought back from our trip to Paris. She wakes him up. "You never would have chosen that painting yourself," she says. "Some woman did. You're having an affair." So yes, eventually she finds out. Her world has been destroyed by me. And she's ready to destroy mine in turn. She calls my husband at work, and screaming so loudly that his secretary in the outer room cannot help but hear, she tells him what a bitch I am. She calls my department chair and my dean and the university president to tell them what I have done. She calls our home and tells my 9-year-old daughter how despicable her mother is. She buys a gun and threatens to kill me and then herself. So this is a story about Claude's wife. No, about Eloise's. Do you see how I almost slipped up? About Eloise's jealousy of me. And to begin with, it's a story about what her jealousy did to me. I was overwhelmed by feelings of loss. Yes, but not so much the likely loss of my relationship with Claude, the likely end of the affair, but rather most profoundly as a loss of myself because of my guilt at never really once ever having thought of her. I'd had such a sense of how beautiful, how creative, how life-giving my love for Claude was. I'd seen him blossom, grow, open up in ways that made it seem as though the very gods were blessing our love. But now I was being forced to see that what had seemed so beautiful was in fact destructive, ugly. I was overcome with self-hatred. It felt as though my very soul had died. I didn't dream. At least I didn't have any access to my dreams for over 9 months, for almost 9 months. Somehow, I managed to go through the routines of being a mother, of being a teacher during the day. But in the middle of every night, I would wake up and be overcome with the emptiness, the deadness, the despair, and would go down to the living room and cry. Not weep, not sob, but keen. It was some strange animal sound that emerged deep from my very guts that frightened me and brought no relief. Like, I now imagine, the sounds that came out of Ereshkigal as she looked at Anana, whom she had impaled upon a hook like a piece of rotting meat, and then grieved at what she had done. At the time, I thought of this nighttime drama as secret and private, and that it was only because no one else could know that would know that I could let these feelings take over. But decades later, many decades later, my youngest son told me what it was like for him to wake up in the middle of the night, to hear his steadying mother crying her heart out, and to not have a clue as to what was happening, but to feel that what had been a safe world no longer was. So I guess this means it's not even just a 3-person event. But back to the story. In the middle of this, and this is what I now remember most vividly, is a scene. Eloise had been sharing with everyone that talkative thing that I was talking about earlier, what I'd done to her, what a destructive, irresponsible bitch I was. But then someone, a colleague of Claude's, told her, Eloise, what you're going through is really awful. It's really awful. But Chris is actually not how you're picturing her. She's a good woman. She's thoughtful. She's accessible. And somehow, I still find this amazing, somehow this gave Eloise the courage to write to me. We agreed to meet in a neutral space. Actually, it was the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Railroad Station. She had already arrived when I came in to the restaurant. She stood up to greet me. We were wearing the same dress. This is really true. I mean, it's... in the same size. A sleeveless PK shift. Though hers was blue and mine was pink. We sat across the table from each other. Two women who could speak about the pain by which each of us felt overwhelmed. She told me that what she was really jealous of was that Claude loved me in the way that she'd always wanted him to love her. It wasn't so much jealousy of our sexual connection as of his readiness to share his soul, his inner world with me. She spoke of how she had been closed off from him sexually because of a lack of this emotional intimacy, and of now understanding that he'd been able to open his soul to me because I had been able to first open to him sexually. Looking at this now, I would say she hated me and wanted to be me. Right. It was an amazing conversation, at the end of which it was easy for me to agree not to see him again for a year, to support her hope that she might possibly now have the marriage she'd always wanted. We separated. But, on my way out of the restaurant, I stopped to phone Claude, who'd quite understandably been very worried about just what might happen during this meeting. So I phoned him and told him what Eloise and I had agreed upon. However, Eloise, too, it turned out, had tried to phone him and had gotten a busy signal. And then had seen me in the phone booth across from her and knew I'd been phoning him, which, of course, led her to conclude that our whole meeting, our whole agreement, had been a farce. Not surprisingly, after this, my pain, my guilt, my self-hatred was even bigger than before and took me over for many, many months. So that's the story. It's in some ways the story of when I really got hit with the unconscious. I think I mentioned earlier, I was 37, more or less the same age as Freud and Jung had been when they experienced their hits. It's a story of being forced to see myself in an utterly new way. For, as I've already said, what had seemed most creative and beautiful in myself, to me, now seemed only ugly and destructive. I could see nothing lovable in me at all. Now, you might ask, wasn't this an extravagant reaction? Yes. Yes. Even then, it seemed too big. The end of the affair, Eloise's suffering, my suffering, were big. But somehow not quite this big. And actually, it wasn't until many years later, when I read Freud's essay, Mourning and Melancholia, that I found language for this too bigness. In his essay, Freud writes of how in mourning, the world has become poor and empty. But that in melancholia, it's the ego itself, the self-aware I, that feels poor and empty. Melancholia seems to entail an overcoming of the life drive, to issue an inexorably harsh self-judgment. And this is the part I found most illuminating in Freud's essay. Melancholia, he says, is a response to an unnameable loss. He speaks of the loss, how it's not clear just what has been lost or why it's so painful. There's something deeply unconscious about it. In mourning, the loss is supposedly conscious, but even there, he believes, the most recent grief always stirs up memories of the never fully grieved losses that preceded, and especially the ungrievable primal loss of fusion with mother and of our own fantasized primal wholeness. So melancholia now feels like a good name for what I was undergoing. I remember so well how initially during that now long ago time, I was just into me, just into how I'd lost myself, how I'd lost touch with my soul. I didn't really think about her, about Eloise, at all. She was invisible, non-existent. Then for a while, I did think of her. But because so I felt she had messed up my life in me. But then, really because of her courage, I began to see her in her life and began to focus on what I had done to another woman. Indeed, retrospectively, this experience is what first made me a feminist. Now that's obviously too simple. Anything like that is overdetermined, right? But it feels like that's the event, you know? And so, and yet, despite the fact that I was beginning to get this, was beginning to get her, I messed it up. And I guess you can imagine how deeply I wished I had never entered that damn phone booth. Yes. Eventually, of course, but it was years, I came to a place where I could recognize, could feel, that though I could never again wholly forget the reality of the ugly and destructive parts of myself, that there are also creative and beautiful ones. Yet this time, this story remains talismanic. Yes, my response was in a sense too big. But I've come to believe that it's the too bigness that makes it potentially transformative. Did I back then, when I was in the middle of all this, get a sense of the archetypal aspect? I think not explicitly, but in a more vague sense, maybe. Did I back then, when I was in the middle of all this, get a sense of any mythical connections? I think not. Though much later, when I wrote the Hera chapter of my goddess book, I did recognize her. That Eloise, like Hera, had focused her anger at me, the other woman, and how the drama really became centered on the relationship between us, the two women, the men, George, Claude, somehow almost disappeared. Later, I could also see connections to the psyche of Apuleius's Cupid and Psyche. Psyche's sisters were envious, but Aphrodite was jealous, fearful that this mortal girl was going to take away her beloved son. I said that part earlier. But, and this is the more important part, I saw that the almost overwhelming tasks that Aphrodite, out of her jealousy, imposed on Psyche were what made it possible for Psyche to really become herself. Okay. So that's one story. But there's another story. I've been jealous too. Not just the object of another's jealousy. And that story begins with River. About midway through our now 35-year marriage, begins with River having an affair. Now, there was nothing secret, nothing hidden about this. Given River and her openness and honesty, that was never even a possibility. But I do know how hurt I was at the outset. I was away. A friend, I'll call her Dora, to whom I knew River was very deeply drawn, was coming for a weekend visit. River had assured me that nothing would happen. But something did. In so powerful a way that River had to share her confusion, had to try to sort out what had happened and what it meant with someone. And she couldn't reach me. So she turned instead to a sister and a friend. And that initially was what I found almost unbearable. Not that she and Dora had made love, but that the world, or so it felt, knew about it before I did. The first weekend led to many more. River was clearly deeply in love, and so was Dora. And I was jealous. What I was most jealous of was how alive her love for this other woman was. And again, there's a scene. I'm lying in our bed, because River's right there beside me. She's asleep. I am not. I'm lying there frightened, really, by realizing how big my jealousy had become. And by knowing that it was my jealousy, not River's affair, that had the potential of destroying our marriage. And somehow I knew what I had to do. So I, who do not pray, and who rarely experience those Greek goddesses from whom I've learned so much, as actual out there presences. I'm not one of those goddess people who have altars and so on. Nevertheless, despite all that, lying there on that bed, I found myself calling out to Hera, the Greek goddess of marriage who knew all about jealousy and its corrosive power. And I prayed to Hera to relieve me of my jealousy. And somehow she was there. She heard me. She responded in a way that led me to feel that the jealousy was just leaking out of my body, through every orifice, through my pores, and leaving me free. Not so much free of my jealousy, as free to enter into it, to engage it, rather than be possessed by it. This time, I was very conscious that I had been in the grip of an archetype, of archetypal energy. And though I have two women friends who went in similarly in the grip of what they knew to be archetypal jealousy, felt that just because it was archetypal, it was right to be carried away, to honor the archetype by letting it roar, even to the point of directing some genuinely destructive energy at the other woman. I knew I didn't want to go in that direction because, remember, I had been the other woman. And I didn't want to do the poor me thing either. I didn't want to respond as Hephaestus had when he designed that golden net that caught his wife Aphrodite in bed with her lover Ares. Hephaestus had wanted all the other gods to witness what this bad pair had been up to. And it's such a sad story. He'd imagined that the other gods would be outraged at what the lovers were up to. He'd imagined he'd win their sympathy. Instead they, well, at least Hermes, just said he wished it were he that was in that bed with the goddess of love. And the others simply laughed at poor cuckolded Hephaestus. So I knew how I didn't want to respond, and I had a sense of how I did want to. I wanted to discover as honestly as I could what was being opened up in me. I wanted to explore in what ways I might have provoked, might even have desired Rivers having an affair. I thought of how maybe me, a part of me, would like to be having an affair. How I too missed the passion in our relationship. And I discovered that part of me actually welcomed her having her affair. Felt that it could provide me with an excuse to get out of this marriage. For I became profoundly aware of how much ambivalence was and is present in my deep love for this woman. I thought I had long ago learned from Freud that we desire what we fear, fear what we desire, hate where we love, love where we hate. But now I was really experiencing the intensity of this ambivalence in a painful and yet weirdly exhilarating way. The affair went on. Eventually, it came to an end. Really, I think, mostly because Dora, though trying to accept River's commitment to our marriage, really couldn't. Of course, she wanted everything. Don't we all? Don't we all? And the impossibility of this was in the end too much. Now, in a sense, of course, though this may complicate my narrative too much, Dora was, of course, also jealous of me, as Circe and Calypso were jealous of Odysseus' commitment to his wife Penelope. I also found myself deeply sympathetic with River's longing to be someone's everything, someone's one and only, which I, with my 5 children, and perhaps also my erotic connection to my professional life, to teaching, could never give her. Although maybe this isn't something any of us can really give another. Though I really felt, how all of us long for that. Participate in that primal archetypal longing. When I shared a draft of the original version of this talk that I gave, and it was different, but it was the same, 3 years ago at Jung on the Hudson. I shared the draft with River, wanting to be sure that this account of an event in our shared lives would ring true for her. And she responded, "You know, Chris, what I think I learned was that I didn't really want to be someone's everything after all. I didn't want the fusion. I wanted the real back and forth, the struggle, the conflicts, even the not enoughness of a real relationship." But while the affair was still very much a reality, I wanted to understand, as best I could, what it was meaning to River to imagine what she was experiencing, which leads me to remember how exquisitely Proust writes about how jealousy stirs up the imagination, how it leads us to pay such detailed attention to the other. He understands that what we really want is to know the other as though from inside, to know, meet the hidden person she is, hidden persons she is, and how this may manifest as a longing to control, to possess. I get that, and of course some of it fits. But I believe that most important for me was how this focused, attentive imagining led me to such a real sense of River's forever mysterious otherness. River and I were lucky. We could share so much of what was going on in each of us with the other. We could, in some measure at least, explore together the personal and archetypal dimensions of what was, after all, a mutual experience. Though I have to admit, we don't really know how, in retrospect, Dora understands this event in her life. The aftermath is not as fully a three-person experience as I might ideally imagine. So I've come to see this experience, to see these experiences of jealousy as issuing in a lesson in finitude, in how much of ourselves always remains unknown, might always suddenly appear to throw us radically off balance, and in how much of a beloved other will always remain unknown to me, but also to herself, and how I can live with that because that's how it is.